Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And this is another episode in our series of discussions that we are doing with Carrie Schertz, the backyard professor, that we are calling the Gospel Topics Essay Series. So we go through each essay in the Gospel Topics Library one at a time. And we use this book, the LDS Gospel Topics Series, a scholarly engagement, sort of as a lens to study these topics through, because each chapter covers a different essay through a different point of view from a scholar. So the one that we are covering in this episode is called DNA and Book of Mormon Studies. And we were so thrilled to be able to have Dr. Thomas Murphy on with us on this episode. He is the expert. We were just pinching ourselves that we were able to get him, weren't we, Landon?
Yeah, he's really sharp on this and has been studying it for years. And what a great expert and what a great podcast this was, because he just came in and we were able to ask him all the questions that we've always wanted to know about the Gospel Topic Essay and DNA. And, you know, is the response accurate? How can we believe the church's answers when it comes to DNA, and whether we could really detect Book of Mormon DNA or not? And he answers all those questions. So it was a very scholarly discussion, but it really got to the heart of the matter. So if you've ever wondered about DNA in the Book of Mormon, this is the episode.
This is the episode for you. That's right. And he explains it, what I felt, in a very clear way. Like, we really understood, because this was a huge smoking gun since it came out a couple decades ago. I mean, this led to changes in the Book of Mormon itself on the title page. And we'll talk about that in this essay. So I hope you all enjoy it. I hope you tune in. And thank you so much from Mormonish.
Welcome to the Backyard Professor Live Sunday night show. We have a really spectacularly informative and interesting show for you tonight. We are going to be having a terrific discussion with a terrific scholar. We want to thank you all for coming to the Backyard Professor Live. We are here to entertain, inform, instruct, and destruct former misconceptions you may have. So let's get this show on the road. Alrighty, tonight is going to be a good night. Let me say hello to all of you real quick, and then I'll bring on my beloved, wonderful guests. Mosiah, yeah, I get it. How you doing? Doug Vincent, how you doing? Debbie Donovan, you wonderful woman, how are you? Nick Johnson, Newton Lemos, Peter Higgs, welcome from down under, I feel like a cow walking through tall grass. I am utterly tickled to be here. Yeah, whatever. Shut up and get the guests on already, cowboy. Laura Paris, welcome, dear. It's good to see you. Mark Crespin, you know it. Here it comes. Wait for it. 3, 2, yeah, baby. 1. Yeah, baby. Just for you, Mark. I don't know why we started this tradition, but it's awesome. Dan Vogel, the man. I love your book. I'm looking in it again. I tell everybody about it. I love it. I've told everybody, if for nothing else, buy it for the introduction. So I hope I'm helping you sell at least 50,000 of those little babies. We're going to get it sold out so that you have to do a second edition. And Dan is hard at work on his next project. So let's bring in our guests. I have with me my two favorite heroes of the podcast world besides all of the others, because everyone is a hero for me, and that would be Thomas Murphy. What are you doing here? Hello, young man. How are you?
Oh, I thought you were bringing the others on, but
I am. I'm just being a smart aleck. That's what I do. So I have the world-class professor, Thomas Murphy, and he is the real professor here, not just the backyard professor. And I have the lovely schoolyard professor, Rebecca Biblioteca, and I have the dynamic, the magnificent, the truly wonderful Landon Brophy, the junkyard professor. How's everyone doing tonight?
We're great.
Great. Have a hangover from your party last night, Carrie, but other than that, we're ready to go.
Hey, wait, hold it. We only served pop and ice cream and water.
That'll
we did,
do it.
yeah.
That'll do it.
And delicious food. Boy.
Just hanging with Carrie's enough to give anyone a hangover.
Well, in that case, you three are in double Dutch as well as the rest of my audience. So we are really excited because Dr. Murphy, you are truly a classic. And I don't mean that because of your age. Don't do it. Don't pull an Isaac Asimov on me. Isaac Asimov hated being called classic. So no. That makes me too old. I don't want to be a classic. But your scholarship really does get to the heart and the idea of so much cultural reality for the indigenous inhabitants of this continent through time. And your background is Mormon. You was Mormon. The DNA issue comes along, something that kind of blindsided us all, didn't it? You and Simon Southerton have been two of the foremost Mormon scholars who have. I remember I was an apologist, Tom.
I remember that.
But yeah. Unfortunately, I was an obnoxious one. Now I'm an obnoxious post-mole. When I was an apologist, I remember when you came out and your famous words, "We have a problem." Because Dan Peterson and Bill Hamblin and John Gee, I was associating with the Farms boys, and we were all saying, yeah, Tom Murphy does have a problem. He doesn't understand DNA. Well, now, how far are we down the road here? 25, 30 years, and now the shoe's on the other foot. Who understands DNA and who doesn't? So thank you for being on the show. Rebecca, would you like to say hi to our beloved guest? And I'll shut up and let you say hi to. And then, Landon, you ask him the tough questions. Oh, wait. No, we've got to hear the presentation first.
Oh, it'll come. It'll be fine. No, I would love to tell the story of how we got Tom to come on the program, which is, I think, so funny. So as we all know, we're going through each gospel topics essay one at a time, one episode per essay. So we knew that this week was going to be Book of Mormon and DNA Studies. That's the title of the church gospel topics essay. So we thought, oh, this might be a little out of our wheelhouse. Why don't we try to find an expert? So Landon and I kind of put our heads together. We're like, who could we invite on? Let's see if Thomas Murphy would come on. So as you guys also all know, we are using this book, the LDS Gospel Topics Series. Everybody hold up your book. We use this as we study the church essays. That's right. And we pay attention to the essays that are written by different scholars. Each chapter in here is a response to a gospel topics essay. So we called Tom, we talked, we're going to have him on the show. And then I said, well, I guess I'd probably better read the essay in the book. I'd already read the church essay. And I go to the essay in the book. He's the author of the essay. I did not do my due diligence before, but then it gave me goosebumps because I thought, oh my goodness, we literally booked the author of the essay. So this is not going to get any better than this. We're going to talk about the church essay. We're going to talk about his amazing essay in this book. This is going to be a real treat. So we're excited.
I'm only one of the authors. So the
That's
other
true.
author, my co-author, Angelo Baca.
Yeah.
That is
Angelo
very
Baca
true.
is also there. Yep.
Yep. No.
And he has a splendiferous documentary that you have kindly shared a link with us, and we will put that in the description on this topic. And we're going to encourage everyone to watch that documentary. It is beautifully done. It was very, very fun and interesting to watch. So,
and it's titled In Layman's Terms, with layman spelled like the Book of Mormon layman.
yes, I thought that was clever. Laman. Yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that because as we went through the essay, Tom, you're part. You have some indigenous blood, correct? You want to tell us a little bit about your history, and then Angelos as well.
Yeah, so I was raised in southern Idaho, not far from where Carrie lives now. But my ancestry traces back to on my mother's side, early Mormons, as well as a Mohawk family that converted to Mormonism later and came west. And so I grew up with these stories of having a Lamanite princess in my family, as my grandma and mother would say. And now I've learned that that's quite an offensive term to use. It's inaccurate in many ways. The Lamanite, let alone the princess. But anyway, that was the way I was raised. So for me, the Book of Mormon was, it was like our family story. There was that personal connection to it. However, because I was raised primarily in white settler culture, when I embarked on this work, I really wanted to consult with Native scholars. And Angelo Baca was then a student at the University of Washington. He actually reached out to me first, but we began a collaboration shortly after I published the first peer-reviewed article on DNA in the Book of Mormon. It was in a book called American Apocrypha and was called The Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics. But anyway, Angelo had reached out to me, and we started a collaboration first around his film, In Layman's Terms, that became his master's thesis at the University of Washington. And then we've collaborated on a number of other projects over the years that had nothing to do with Mormonism. But in 2015, we decided to get back involved in Mormon studies and did an article responding to the essay, not the DNA essay, as well as the race essay. It's called Rejecting Racism in Any Form, Latter-day Saint Religion, Rhetoric, and Repatriation. And I've sent a link to a free copy of these articles to Landon to put in the show notes. But anyway, Angelo and I have been collaborating on for a number of years. He is also raised Mormon. His mother was in the student placement program. He's enrolled with the Navajo Nation, but also of Hopi descent, and just an excellent scholar. Currently he's got a PhD now from New York University in anthropology, and he teaches communications or native film studies at Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the best film schools in the world.
So, wow. So when you wrote this, one of the things we noticed as we started reading through it, and you actually, when we talked yesterday, you had actually mentioned that you guys are trying to look at re-examining how we look at the DNA more from an indigenous terms, and how the term Lamanite and how the church's teachings that all the people, basically North America, South America, the Pacific Islanders, all of those people that they want to refer to as Lamanites, how that has basically affected their culture and affected them as peoples, and almost stolen their culture, and that it's time to give it back. And you've been trying to reframe how we look at the church's essays and how we look at the DNA with the Lamanites. And so as we read through, we were looking and we were going, okay, our audience is going to want to understand, are the things in the church's essays, are they valid? Are their counter arguments valid or not? Is this science and the things they say about science correct? They'd like to throw things in to cast doubt upon it. And so with Tom here, it's great because we're going to get to see both sides of this. We're going to get to see, is this credible? Is the science correct? Are the responses to the essay correct? But also, how does these responses affect the indigenous and native peoples, and how has that impacted their culture? And so anyone who wants to see it, that film in layman's terms really captures that. He talks to some people in Hawaii, the people in upstate New York, more the Native Americans. I'm trying to remember, I don't think he hit any South Americans, but obviously with the church, they try to teach that everybody's a Lamanite until we get into the essay. And then all of a sudden it's like, no, it's a very small population. There's hardly anyone who fits these categories. So we're going to look at that. And so we've got some slides we'll pull up, and we'll just use these to guide the conversation. And as we get there, we're going to start asking questions, and people in the chat, if you have questions or you have things you ever wanted to know about DNA, because we aren't the experts. That's why we brought Professor Murphy on, because he's got that kind of knowledge to be able to troubleshoot these challenges that the church throws at us. So let's throw up that first slide, Gary.
Just before we do, I just thought of an analogy because of the way that you have discussed Professor Murphy's excellent work with indigenous people. You're trying to get their point of view. Robert Rittner did the exact same thing with the Egyptology and the Book of Abraham. And so for you to be in that kind of a camp, I would propose is a terrific honor on your part as well, because the church has tried too hard to make absolutely everybody in the world white and delightsome and Mormon, and it's not working. So that's how it is. So let's go to this first slide.
Yeah, let's jump in this, because as Rebecca and I started reading through this, boy, we were reading it in the car, and we were just getting angry. We weren't even one paragraph in, and we're going, what in the world? We just started getting angry. So we'll go ahead. Let's go ahead. This is what we've done is we've just picked certain paragraphs out of the essay, ones that we felt were the most controversial, or the most where they make claims that they either could back up or couldn't back up. There's a whole section that goes over DNA and mitochondrial DNA and how you use DNA. And we didn't want to get in the technical side. We just wanted to get more into the, are these questions accurate, and are the things that they stated accurate? So the first question is the Book of Mormon historical? And it's a little small, but I'll go ahead and try to read that. This is the first, I think this is actually the first paragraph of it. And they say, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints affirms that the Book of Mormon is a volume of sacred scripture comparable to the Bible. It contains a record of God's dealings with these groups of people who migrated from the Near East or West Asia to the Americas hundreds of years before the arrival of Europeans. Which this in alone was very upsetting as we read this paragraph, because they talk about the Near East or West Asia. They throw in that I don't remember any migration from West Asia in the Book of Mormon. From the near, I should say they're saying Near East or West Asia, which is, I guess they're calling that Jerusalem area. But the DNA goes completely counter to that, and we'll get to that. He said, although the primary purpose of the Book of Mormon is more spiritual than historical, some people have wondered whether the migration it describes is compatible with scientific studies of ancient Americas. The discussion has centered on the field of population genetics and developments in DNA science. Some have contended that the migration mentioned in the Book of Mormon did not occur because the majority of DNA identified to date in modern native peoples most closely resembles that of Eastern Asian populations. So right off the bat, as we read this, they go right at, okay, we're saying the Book of Mormon is spiritual. We're not really saying it's historical. Rebecca, as we read that, we got pretty upset about that. You want to kind of say
they got so upset they emailed me and they said, we are swearing right now. We will try to control ourselves.
Yeah, I think our criteria for choosing what we kind of focused on is if it made us say, "Oh, come on," that we call it the "Oh, come on" criteria. Because we're of an age where we, of course, remember something very different. And when you read this, it's very subtle. Some people wonder, who are these people? And just the idea that it could even be considered not historical, that was not at all anything that any of us of a certain age grew up with. So that right away made us think, okay, I see what direction this essay is going to go. They're just very much backpedaling to make some of their arguments make sense and to be a little more convenient. So we right off the bat were like, okay, this is going to be interesting. What did you think, Carrie? Were you also throwing the essay behind you like you do in your books? Oh, here he goes again. I should never encourage him. Oh no. We experienced that firsthand. We were at his house last night, and you have to duck. It's kind of one of those.
We threw books. Yeah, we've got pictures. Yeah, the thing I found about so many of, if not all of them, so far the ones that we've explored, is there always just seems to be a subtlety. There seems to be a hidden hook that the church will lead you down a certain kind of thinking, and there's this hook that you don't see, and then they grab you. And it's that hook, and I'm not trying to be negative, but it is not as straightforward as anything Tom has written concerning this subject. And I think it's unfortunate that's the way they handle it. So what was your reaction on all that, Tom?
Well, when I write about other scholars, I include their names and I include a citation and a link to their work so that people can read other scholars in their own words. Because it's, anytime we're critiquing somebody else's work, it's possible that we misunderstand it. It's possible that we misrepresent it as well in our work. And what I noticed right away is that, some people, I kind of recognized myself in that, right? And Simon Southerton I'd put in there as well, but it's not just us, it's the whole field. There was a video that both Simon and I participated in called DNA versus the Book of Mormon, and then put out by Living Hope Ministries, and they interviewed a whole slew of geneticists and anthropologists and biologists, and we all were, even the LDS ones that were interviewed in there, like Trent Stevens and D. Jeffrey Meldrum, all pretty much acknowledge that there is no affirmative evidence from genetics for the Book of Mormon. And that is a positive element that this introduction does. It acknowledges essentially what I almost got excommunicated for saying, is that there's no affirmative evidence to support the Book of Mormon coming from DNA. And so it's nice to say, okay, I was right. Maybe that's why they backed off excommunicating me. After the media pressure got a little hard on him. I think that's probably part of it.
Yeah.
The other thing that I was thinking is that I like that statement that it's more spiritual than historical. Unfortunately, it's couched between a statement that suggests that it's historical, that there were actual migrations, and then a statement says, well, for those who worry about the history, here's a way to resolve it, presumably. And I wish they had just made the entire essay about read the Book of Mormon spiritually rather than historically, and what could you get out of it from that? I mean, that would be an amazing essay to read. I'd be delighted to do that.
Of course, Tom, if we read it only under a spiritual and not a historical, there'd be no reason to wonder about the DNA, because we would be saying there doesn't matter if these are real people. But it seems like it does matter whether these people really happened, especially as you look at it from your point of view with how it's affected the indigenous people, because it's very hard to say, well, it's a spiritual book that talks about all of these people, and yet they've basically stolen the culture of these people because they're saying this is historical and true. Therefore, your people, are going to become white and delightsome. They were the descendants of these people. And so it almost has to be historical in order for the book to to have meaning to a lot of these people. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, one of my favorite Native scholars, P. Jane Hafen, says basically to present the Book of Mormon as history is a singularly colonizing act. It's a way of erasing indigenous history and replacing it with a history that came out of a seer stone in a hat. And, you know, I think that actually seer stones in a hat seem to me like a really cool way to produce a story. But it's a story, it's not history. I've never met a historian that found a history in a hat or in a seer stone. But it sounds like a really cool, creative way to spin a story, and that story might have other kinds of truths that are not historical, but might have, sometimes fiction can be more powerful and more have a bigger impact than history. So I have no objections to using a seer stone in a hat as a device to catalyze spiritual thought and ideas, but then to turn around and present it as if it were history, that's fraud, to put it bluntly.
Well, and then to ensure that everybody who wants to remain in the church must follow that interpretation, or you're not faithful. You're made to feel guilty. You're made to feel lesser than, and that's when I entirely agree with you. And this is interesting, Tom, because 10 years ago, I would have vehemently disagreed with you. Well, 15 years ago, I would have vehemently disagreed with you.
I remember you doing that.
I actually did, didn't I? Yeah, you and I kind of butted heads, and here we are. You won, my friend. So you and the evidence, but yeah, that's an important point. The stone in the hat is actually, like Dan Vogel would say, that's pretty clever. That's genius. That's kind of cool. But don't tell us it's history, and we have to believe that. So. Yeah.
Right. And if I could add, I was thinking when you talk about erasing an entire culture. So my grandparents went on Book of Mormon tours in the 50s and 60s. It was huge. They would go to South America. They would go on these Book of Mormon tours. They would come home. All of us grandkids would gather around and look at the slides. And we would see all this incredible art and the architecture of Mesoamerica. But we, of course, were told this is a baptismal font. And then they showed us that this is, the Holy of Holies. Or, I didn't think much about it as a child. But as I got to be older, I understood that they almost literally have separate tours. If a tour guide says this is a Mormon group, they will tell them this false narrative. Other tour groups come in, they'll give them, the more scientific, what they know to be more true. So it's a complete fabrication. The reality is erased, but people like my grandparents back in the day, they loved that. That was their reality. There was no other reality. This is a Mormon baptismal font that the Lamanites used. And that was a fact to them. So it's disturbing now in hindsight.
And the other half of P. Jane Hafen's, she's a Taos Pueblo scholar. The other half of her statement is that to listen to Native people tell their own stories is a decolonizing act. And that's why I'd encourage everyone to watch in layman's terms and hear indigenous people tell the story in their own terms. Pete Jemison, whose work is featured there, Angelo and I just hung out with him after the Mormon History Association in New York. And found it, a great chance to reconnect with him after doing this film nearly 20 years ago. And we could take that sort of approach. The LDS Church could take an approach that recognized the Book of Mormon as a story and indigenous stories as a story as well. But those are the indigenous stories, where the Book of Mormon is a settler colonial story, one imposed upon Native people rather than produced by them.
Interesting. Yeah. Very excellent insight.
Yeah, and the church itself seems to be divided on really who these people are, where they're from. Carrie, you want to pull up that Trexmo slide? As we all know, Rebecca loves doing the Trexmo.
There it is.
Star Trek. But you've got this
one of my
division
favorite
in the
ones.
church. Yeah.
Heartland, Mesoamerica. Yeah, it's
That's
the
right.
clap, right? Right there.
And we sit back and we watch those two sides that go, even Carrie, you had some recently on your show discussing the Heartland model versus the Mesoamerican model. And it's funny because, some are saying, no, it happened in Mesoamerica. Others says, no, it's in the heartland of America, which would make it two completely different sets of people. If it's in Mesoamerica, you're talking, Mayan people, Olmec people. If it happened in the heartland, we're talking about Native American tribes that would have been the Lamanites or the descendants of those people. The church wants to grow that model and take it to almost the entire northern and southern hemisphere, as well as the Pacific Islands of the seas. So, Tom, any thoughts on that, or I'm assuming that you guys looked at both Heartland and Mesoamerican for DNA samples, and did you find any links to anything Semitic or from that looks like it came from Western Asia as opposed to Eastern Asia?
Well, I was raised with more of a hemispheric
model
perspective of the Book of Mormon, and what's interesting is that this church's essay on DNA rejects the hemispheric model outright.
Yeah.
And so that's actually quite amazing.
That's anti-Mormon.
All right. I mean, there at the time that Simon and I were first publishing our research, there was a small group of people at BYU associated with farms and fair, and that Kerry Shirts guy had something to do with that. It wasn't very fair, but anyway. Those small groups were advocating a limited geography, and they actually stole the idea from the the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the RLDS. They're the ones who first came up with a limited geography in Mesoamerica, and then it gets adopted by folks at BYU. That was not a mainstream LDS point of view, at least in my experience, this DNA has totally turned that upside down. So now there are competing limited geographies. Is it a Heartland limited geography or a Mesoamerican limited geography? And on one hand, they want it to be very limited. So when they're talking about the DNA evidence, they say, well, it all disappeared. And yet both of those models, actually, when you look at them closely, they involve millions of people and millions of acres of land. I mean, it's not really that small in terms of when you actually start putting it down on a map. I mean, Brant Gardner has a recent essay in the Interpreter trying to make the limited geography into a teeny tiny one. But otherwise those are just really way too large for plausibility. To answer the question about what did we find in terms of the genetics, there was no, and there still is, no affirmative DNA evidence of any pre-Columbian migration from the ancient Near East, whether you're talking about Southwest Asia or North Africa or the bottom corner of Europe along the Mediterranean. None of that area do we find prior to Columbus, and so it eliminates all possibilities. And even though in my essay I did my Lamanite Genesis, genealogy, and genetics, I did focus primarily on the hemispheric model, and so did Simon Southerton in his work. But neither of us avoided looking at the limited geographies. I predicted that the limited geographies would become more prominent because of the DNA, but we tested those as well and found them equally failing.
And he's saying this, folks, July 2nd, 2023. This is the very newest information. We still don't have anything. And how long? This has been going at least throughout our lifetimes, right, Tom?
Yeah. Well, and let me address kind of a big problem with Rod Melderman in particular and the Heartland advocates, because they are actually using false narratives. They're being deceptive in their presentation of DNA evidence. So they take the X lineage, which both Simon and I looked at before we published our work. And this X lineage is it's a maternal lineage. So there's 5 major maternal lineages that are found in Native American populations. They're called A, B, C, D, and X. A, B, C, and D, because those were the first matrilineages identified. So a matrilineage is your genetics going through your mother's 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 mother, along using our mitochondrial DNA, and that was some of the first genetic evidence, or DNA evidence, I should say. Genetics includes a broader spectrum, but the first DNA evidence was mitochondrial DNA that was being looked at. And the X lineage wasn't identified as early because it's relatively rare, even in native populations, about 1 to 2%. Some populations a little bit higher, and those populations just happen to be in northeastern America, and it happened to be in the same area where Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon. And so when I was looking at it initially, I was very interested in this X lineage, and I thought, oh well, maybe there is some sort of connection, and so I started delving into the research quite deeply, and I found, even back in 2001 when I was writing that work originally, that the evidence already showed the X lineage was way too old to be a Book of Mormon population. And although it wasn't widespread in Asia, it had been found in a few locations in Asia. There was one in Siberia, and at least as relatives of the X2A lineage, which is the one found in the Americas. And so it was clear that X lineage couldn't be evidence for the Book of Mormon. Am I getting feedback?
No.
There's a little bit on my end that I can hear. Not bad, though. I've been able to understand you. The audience hasn't been complaining about any kind of echo or anything. So.
Yeah, they're just complaining about my lighting.
Right in this room,
hey, Landon looks good if it was pitch black.
We're at Mormonish Studios North, so Rebecca, we're at my house, and Rebecca's in my studio, and I'm in the one
that I
with the
needed the ring
sunlight
lighting
coming right
more
through
than
the
he
window.
did.
So it's adjusting as the sun goes down.
But I do hear a little bit of something again. Oh my gosh, this happens every time. So I'm not sure. Hopefully it won't get worse. I don't know if someone has feedback or we need earphones, but
okay. Well,
I
do hear myself feedback.
Yeah.
So while you're doing that, let's pull up the next slide, because the church does what the church always does when they don't have an explanation, is they attack the science. Rebecca, can you read that? Is that too small without your glasses?
If I lean way up and everybody looks up my nose, no, I can read it. So is DNA science credible? They're going to ask this question because here in 2023, we still don't know if DNA science is something that we can trust. So basic principles of population genetics suggest that the need for a more careful approach to the data. The conclusions of genetics, like those of any science, are tentative. Yes, they're very tentative. And much work remains to be done to fully understand the origins of the native populations of the Americas. So right there, that little statement casts a lot of doubt and also gives people a lot of reassurance that although you may have heard that there's all this information about DNA and DNA studies and the DNA not matching, we're here to tell you that that's tentative and there's still a lot to be learned, so you can kind of rest easy. I think it's a reassuring essay if that causes you some concern to hear about these new DNA studies. So what did you think, Carrie?
Is this just me, or does it appear to you that they actually do take this approach, though, with every single book of scripture?
Yeah.
Book of Abraham is what I immediately thought of. I hate to say I have Book of Abraham on the brain, but what are they always saying? Well, the Egyptologists don't know everything yet. We don't quite have all the full meaning, so we don't have all of the papyri. Maybe there really is a lost scroll or whatever. They're always trying to kick the can down the road, it appears to me, in order to help people say, okay, yeah, there are issues, or else there may be issues, but it's okay because we still have the scripture. Thank goodness, and we can still maintain our faith and testimony. That's my take.
Yeah, these things are tentative. Science is just tentative. It's, you know, look, they used to think, you know, the world was flat and you know, so they were wrong. They're wrong here. It's eventually we're going to find things, and they don't make the connection, or they never state that we're getting closer and closer. We're not getting further and further away from identifying, you know, where these groups are from, and we're really nailing down on it. So, Tom, is there any validity in that the science is just tentative at this point, and that we're going to find this missing race in the future?
Well, if it's so tentative, why change the Word of God, or at least the introduction to the Word of God?
Yes.
Checkmate.
There you go.
Beautiful.
It's the evidence is strong enough to change the Book of Mormon itself. I mean, in 2006, they edited the introduction to the Book of Mormon, which, you know, notably didn't come from Joseph Smith and the Seer Stone, but came from probably Bruce R. McConkie in 1981, when LDS scholars were first really taking on quite strongly this limited geography. It was a pushback against the limited geography by putting a statement in the introduction that said that the American Indians are the principal ancestors of the American Indians. That was a rejection of the limited geography. So that they peel back and change it now to say among the American Indians are among the ancestors of the American Indians. Well,
yeah, can you pull up slide 7, Carrie, while he's talking about this?
Yeah, we did put this on a slide.
That shows it very
all
well.
of us grew up with that statement on the title page.
Leave it
We all knew it. That's what it was. You can't tell us it wasn't there. And now it says something different. One word.
Yeah, if you can pull that up, that shows where they've made that change. And
there we go.
There it is. That's what Dr. Murphy is talking about right there. That's the
one
book.
Word.
Now, we were raised with the one on the left, the standard. No question about it.
Yeah, and so that they changed it first in 2006 in a privately published version of the Book of Mormon, and then in the LDS English versions in 2013. Many of the foreign language versions are still the principal ancestor. And every time a missionary comes by to talk to me, I ask them to pull out the Book of Mormon and check on it. And I have yet to have one that's come with the new version. So I don't know how widespread it is.
Interesting.
Huh.
Yeah, and they're mentioning that in the chat, that it was the double day edition that they sent out, and they changed from principal to among, which is telling, because the principal is to say that they're not the principal ancestors anymore, that there were all these other people there, becomes a huge thing, because it actually contradicts what the Book of Mormon itself tells us. So not only are you're changing it to meet the DNA, but you have to actually change the story of the Book of Mormon to make it fit into that new narrative. And we do want to get to that in just a few minutes. So let's go to the slide number 4. And I know the slide didn't quite come through right. But this picture kind of shows a group of natives from, I would say this is probably South American, because we wanted to include all the different peoples that the church claims to be, Lamanite people. And sorry about the wording, didn't convert from PowerPoint to the slideshow for StreamYard. But Carrie, you've got that there. Do you want to read about that? And the question that we're going to ask Tom is, should we see the DNA from the Near East or from Western Asia? Should it be detected in some of these populations if the Book of Mormon really happened in the way that it said? So, Carrie, you want to read that?
Nothing is known about the DNA of the Book of Mormon peoples, and even if their genetic profile were known, there are sound scientific reasons that it might remain undetected. For these same reasons, arguments that some defenders of the Book of Mormon make based on DNA studies are also speculative. In short, DNA studies cannot be used decisively to either affirm or reject the historical authenticity of the Book of Abraham. Now that's
Not Abraham.
apologetic. That's typical apologetic. That's how they talk.
Yeah, I think that said Mormon, but I think Abraham was fitting.
Carrie
Just
sees
as likely,
Abraham.
yeah.
No matter what it says, Carrie sees Abraham.
Yeah. Well, and here's the other issue about this. Because they're virtually forced to take this approach, they've even gotten to the absurd proportion position. I mean, that there are some things that the church remains neutral on, and yet we're told that their deity knows all and that their deity talks to them every Thursday night in the upper room of the Salt Lake Temple over hot chocolate and donuts. I mean, come on, man, let's get consistent. But, and I know Tom would be familiar with this, we don't have a way to fundamentally prove, or as they say, confirm or refute the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon or the Book of Abraham or any of Joseph Smith's visions or truths in the scriptures, but we can approach this with a probability. And we would be justified based upon where the evidence points either for or against in either accepting or rejecting whatever the proposition is based on evidence, and being open to the fact that future evidence we will look at. Is that off base at all? I mean, that appears to me like that's your life work right there, Dr. Murphy. Yeah.
Well, if the Book of Mormon account as presented in the text actually occurred, it most definitely would have registered genetically. Even if you grant a limited geography rather than the text as written, because it is not a limited geography, then even if you grant that, you would still see genetic traces of a population, even a small population coming into the Americas. We have plenty of examples of that sort of thing. I mentioned in my early work the example of the Limba people in South Africa having clearly identified Jewish ancestry. And, there have been a number of examples of small groups of people coming into other populations that are detectable genetically. There's evidence even in Iceland of a single native woman migrating to Iceland long before Columbus. And her DNA is found in populations of Icelandic people still today. With thousands of descendants, and that's the sort of thing that we would expect to see. There is Sephardic or Jewish immigration that did occur coming into the Americas in the 16th, 17th centuries, coming from Spain, and so basically you had in 1492. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain, and the last day they could be in Spain was the day that Columbus's ship sailed to the New World. And so historically, there's a lot of evidence that there were conversos, as they're called, that had converted to Christianity and then escaped because they had to convert to Christianity even to get on the ship. Right. And so they came to the Americas and did clandestine Judaism in the Americas and maintained it here. So their genetic traces are in Latin American populations today, and we can date them very specifically to the 16th, 17th century. And we can distinguish those Jewish lineages from those that came with later migrations from England and Germany that it came into Latin America, European migrations that also included some Jewish ancestry, and those are dated to a couple of centuries later, and we can find that evidence is there, especially when we look at full genomic studies. And I should say that this essay was likely written by Hugo Perego, and Hugo Perego. He just like I did, he got excited about the X lineage and went to working on the X lineage, which is a mitochondrial lineage. So his focus is on mitochondrial DNA, not whole genome studies. And so he doesn't really even consider whole genome studies to a significant degree in this essay. But interestingly, his work on X lineage is quite credible and refutes very strongly the idea that the X lineage could be a Book of Mormon population, because he shows in his peer-reviewed scientific research that the X lineage was here at least 10,000 more years before the events of the Book of Mormon, and that's taking a very broad timeline for the Book of Mormon. So he got interested in the X lineage. Rod Meldrum also interested in the X lineage, but he misrepresents the science. He basically lies about it to say that because the X lineage is also found in the Middle East, that he claims it originates in the Middle East and that it's a Middle Eastern DNA. But that's not true, because it's also found in Africa, it's found in Europe, it's found in Asia, it's found in Native Americans. And so to call it a Middle Eastern lineage is deceptive. There's no scientist that calls it a Middle Eastern lineage, only Rod Meldrum. So I should mention that Angelo and I, along with Simon Southerton, recently published an article in the Journal of Northwest Anthropology called Science and Fiction, Kennewick Man / the Ancient One in Latter-day Saint Discourse. And we looked at the use of the Kennewick Man in both the Mesoamerican and Heartland geographies, and how those scholars have misrepresented the X lineage and DNA evidence more generally, and shown some alternative ways that indigenous Mormons have read the Book of Mormon that don't require the Book of Mormon to be historical, that see it instead as merely spiritual, or merely figurative or allegorical. And those perspectives are quite compatible with the science. And that article, interestingly, just won the May Timbimbu Perry Indigenous Studies Award from the Mormon History Association, which is funded by the Red Center at BYU. And so Simon Southerton, Angelo Baca, and I each got a $500 check that ultimately came from BYU to acknowledge the credibility of our research that was peer-reviewed and published in a mainstream anthropology journal.
Well,
Awesome.
so I want to sum this up with a yes or no question. Should the DNA been detected if the story was true?
Absolutely should have been.
Yeah, that's a yes, thumbs up.
Just so you understand, for those who are watching this, who do have loved ones still in the church, or neighbors, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, whatever, friends, etc. When I was an apologist, we just flat out rejected Dr. Murphy's claim here. And the amazing thing is, now that I am open to, and I know this sounds funny, but I honestly thought I was open as an apologist, but now that I am open to understanding, and I have had Dr. Simon Southerton on here talking about Kennewick Man, and now we have Dr. Murphy here. Now that I'm understanding this other side with the full evidence, that is not a laughing matter. The science is always going to be tentative, of course. Nobody claims otherwise. That's almost a red herring in a way. That's a diversion away from the real issue. Even if it is tentative, the evidence is such, it appears to me, that we can justifiably say with Dr. Murphy, yes, based on what we know right now, we should be able to find that, and we don't. The Lambda is I loved that part of your essay, because the Lambda is an absolutely flawless example where a very small group of Jews are still detectable today. So
yeah, we did in our book club, we actually did we read a book on genetics and DNA. I'm trying to remember the name of the book that we read, but we several of us went and did the
23andMe. Yeah.
Yeah. You want to talk a little bit about that, Rebecca, and
Well,
kind of what
I found out I found out I have a very large, comparatively large percentage of Neanderthal, right? Which I thought was really interesting. A lot of us are finding this out, and my parents are very faithful. I went and told that to them, and my dad said, "That's not real," and my mom said, "That's on your father's side." So I had no response.
honey, your father was the caveman.
That's on your father's side. Yes, that's kind of how they said it. So it does seem to me that when, our faithful relatives are kind of faced with this kind of thing, it does cause a little bit of cognitive dissonance, because you have this whole narrative that you believe is completely historical. Now you're faced with, some results and things that almost everyone else in the world seems to think, yes, this is accurate. I can find out where I came from. I can find out, genetically who I am. And it does cause a little bit of pause, because we were pretty secure in our worldview before, right? Until that DNA, dang it, that pesky DNA. And it's only going to reveal more, I feel.
Well, the Neanderthal takes us back thousands and thousands of years before Adam was a twinkle in God's eye.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
So, and it was amazing how accurate it was. It told me, you're probably from the Mormon corridor. I mean, I sent this back to wherever their lab in New Jersey or wherever it was, and they come back with just my spit, and they tell me, you're probably from this area, and it traced my roots all the way back. It went through how I came out of Africa. Even it would tell you, you came out, then the people went here, and then they came up around into this area, and then eventually they came over here, and it was just, I'm just sitting here going, oh my gosh, all of that from my spit, it was incredible. Yeah, and we were comparing our stories and looking at the mixes, and it was amazing how accurate it was and how much it could tell you about your history. Just the things that I knew, it confirmed, and then told me so many more things that I didn't know. It was just amazing. So yeah, it was really a neat experience.
Fine girl in the chat said, well, maybe it was also just your return address on the kit that you sent.
Yeah, could have
been. Good one, fine girl.
That's true science. Yep.
Well, the Neanderthal example is a great example of a small mating event, maybe just one or two or few, that has had a widespread impact in human populations. So this probably occurred, somewhere between 100 and 28,000 years ago. Actually, I don't remember off the top of my head. I think they have some more precise dating. I think there were a couple of these mating events. And I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but they're in that range, because the last Neanderthal was about 28,000 years ago. And these have left widespread evidence of this, modern human having relations with a Neanderthal. And now people throughout Europe, Asia, the Pacific, and the Americas, most everyone has about 1%, sometimes 2%, in some cases a little bit more, of Neanderthal ancestry, and yet hardly anybody from Africa does. And so that actually helps us identify where this mating event occurred. And that's the part too that is kind of missing from the church's essay. We may not know Lehi's DNA, but we know where Lehi came from. Okay, we know the community. We know that he was a Hebrew, and that he had Hebrew ancestors, and we know that they lived in Jerusalem, which is part of the Greater Middle East. And yet, there's not any lineages in the Greater Middle East that connect with the Book of Mormon during its supposed time frame.
Interesting. Yeah, Doug Vincent in our chat is saying that he has 3% Neanderthal, and that RFM is Vulcan.
Well, let's go to Trexmo. Let's go to the next slide.
That's a good segue. RFM is
a good segue right into it.
Here we go. Right there.
One more. There you go. You know what's funnier than people thinking Klingons are real? Mormons thinking Nephites are real. Of course, then Spock says, well, Klingons still might be real.
They happen in the future, so we might still find them in the future.
Just say.
In my newest work is developing what I call a neophyte interpretive model of the Book of Mormon. And so substituting neophytes for Nephites. So neophyte is a term used, and it's still used today, but it was used in the 19th century to describe native converts to Christianity. And people don't realize that native people had converted to Christianity in the area of New York for 200 years before Joseph Smith came around, in Central America for 300 years before Joseph Smith was born. So there's a long history of interacting with Christianity. And you know what the Christian missionaries insisted that converts do? Not just convert to Christianity, but they had to start using domesticated animals like horses and cattle and sheep and goats. And that they should use European technologies, things like steel and glass and all these anachronisms that are in the Book of Mormon were being used by native converts to Christianity as part of their conversion process, because the missionaries didn't believe you could be a true Christian unless you were civilized, was the term that they used. You had to be civilized, and that meant you raised domesticated animals, you ate wheat and barley and oats, and you used steel and these sorts of technologies, and rode in wagons, or rather than chariots, but at least close.
Don't forget the submarines either.
Yeah. And, that these neophytes are a much better model for the Nephites of the Book of Mormon. And in fact, Joseph Smith, in his treasure digging activities in both the Ganagua Basin, which is where Palmyra is, Ganagua is a Seneca village that was at Palmyra. And in that Ganagua Basin that includes the Seneca site called Ganondagan, there was a 17th century French attack on Ganondagan, where you had basically all the warriors were out elsewhere, and so you had all the young children, kind of these stripling warriors, running out and fighting against the French, and they left all sorts of traces of that battle in around Ganondagan and in the Ganagua Valley, which is where Joseph Smith was engaged in his treasure digging activities. That included steel and horses, and because these technologies had some of it was the French, but some of it had already been incorporated into Ganondagan as a community. And then Joseph Smith's engaging in similar work in the Susquehanna Valley, where there was this Oneida village called Onaquaga. And Onaquaga was kind of the model neophyte community. The missionaries were focusing on that and really emphasizing how civilized the people were. They were even turning white, and they were, according to the missionaries, and they were using cattle and sheep and goats, and they had farms that looked more like European farms. They used plows. Plows were a big deal because natives had agriculture. They had corn, beans, and squash in particular throughout much of the Americas, but they didn't use the plow. So the missionaries really emphasized they had to use the plow. And that's what people were doing in these places where Joseph Smith was digging for treasure.
So I want to go to the next slide, because this ties into that very thing that you're talking about. And Carrie, can you read that?
Yeah. The ancestor of the American Indians. The evidence assembled to date suggests that the majority of Native Americans carry largely Asian DNA. Scientists theorize that in an era that predated Book of Mormon accounts, a relatively small group of people migrated from Northeast Asia to the Americas by way of a land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska. These people, scientists say, spread rapidly to fill North and South America and were likely the primary ancestors of modern American Indians. The Book of Mormon provides little direct information about cultural contact between the peoples it describes and others who may have lived nearby. Consequently, most early Latter-day Saints assumed that Near Easterners or Western Asians like Jared, Lehi, Mulek, and their companions were the first or the largest or even the only groups to settle the Americas. Building upon this assumption, critics insist that the Book of Mormon does not allow for the presence of other large populations in the Americas, and that therefore Near Eastern DNA should be easily identifiable among modern native groups. And isn't this one of the issues that B.H. Roberts found also with the languages in his Book of Mormon study? Kind of similar, kind of a similar situation with that. So
yeah,
many.
This slide is loaded. It's got all kinds of things. And one of the things that Dr. Murphy pulled up when I sent this slide was that the migrations shown on here are actually animal migrations. And I wanted to discuss that a little bit because the essay focuses only on indigenous peoples' DNA, but we know from the Book of Mormon there were actually, they claim that there's 3 different migrations. You had Mulek and his group from at the time of the Babylonian captivity. You have Nephi and his group, but we also had the Jaredites who came over supposedly after the Tower of Babel. And although they had that big battle that supposedly wiped them all out, so there's no DNA of any of them left because they killed each other, what didn't get wiped out or would not have gotten wiped out in that battle is the seeds and the agriculture and the animals, because we're told they brought flocks with them. We're told they brought, the seeds that they were going to plant, as well as we know that same stuff supposedly was supposed to have happened with the Nephites. So you just mentioned that, corn, beans, and squash were the 3 sisters of the Native Americans prior to Columbus. And yet I don't believe we read about those anywhere in the Book of Mormon, that those crops aren't mentioned. Instead, they're listing crops, like you said, oats, wheats, barley. I know they claim this mini barley or some sort of barley as what they had, but DNA tests have been done on the animals. DNA tests have been done on the crops, and we can tell where the domesticated crops came from. And those domesticated crops came from Europe, from a time post Columbus. None of these crops were here prior to Columbus. Only ones that were, not the only, because potatoes and other things, but the main crops are what you just mentioned, as well as the animals. We should have seen the flocks, the sheep. The DNA should say that these domesticated animals came from the Middle East, and we didn't even have flocks. There were no sheep in the Americas. Can you talk a little bit about the DNA of the flora and the fauna that is also indigenous?
But it's in the sealed 2/3.
Yeah.
In the sealed plate. So you're just wasting time.
Yeah. So there's no human migration in history in which humans traveled alone. Didn't happen. Okay. I mean, we are ecosystems, even in our own body, right? We have gut microbes. We've got all sorts of bacteria that live on us and survive with us that are a part of us, right?
Carrie's got more of that than the rest of us.
But we also always take our food sources with us, right? The plants and animals in these migrations. And so one of the things we do as anthropologists, we trace migrations by not just human DNA, but also by the animals, the bones that are left behind, by their DNA. And so we can test the Book of Mormon migration events multiple ways, not just with human DNA. And they all come up with the same consistent result. And that is that none of the people, plants, and animals that are mentioned in the Book of Mormons migrated to the Americas from the Middle East. I will point out, just as a minor point of clarification, that corn is mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Okay, but corn did not come from the Middle East. Okay, it came from Central America, and so I mean they got one hit, right? They did say that
which was available at the time of Joseph Smith. Corn was obviously a crop that he would have known about. Yeah,
and well known that it was a Native American crop, but. Like I said, I think his mentality was that of a missionary. His brother Hiram had been trained alongside other missionaries at Moore's Indian Charity School in New Hampshire. So his mindset was that of the missionary that expected these European plants and animals and technologies to be a part of the conversion process. So he couldn't have an ancient Christian population that met the standards of the day for Christianity without those plants and animals. And I think because he probably encountered them in his treasure digging activities, or certainly heard about other people who had, that he didn't seem to have a problem incorporating them into the story. There's also a possibility that Joseph Smith never thought the thing was historical to begin with. That he thought he could have very well thought it was made up, and saw the plates as props for the people that are more simple minded than the ones that are deep thinkers. Or I mean, it's entirely possible that was Joseph Smith's frame of mind.
The pious fraud idea. As long as it gets people to believe in God, from whom all good comes, it wouldn't matter if it's fiction or history. Yeah, Dan.
Dan in his first biography of Joseph Smith that makes a really good case for Joseph Smith's confessions are written right into the Book of Mormon itself.
Right there in it. Yeah.
Well, we were looking at, when you take those DNA things and you take the plants and the animals away, you start looking at some of the stories in the Book of Mormon, and they just wouldn't make sense to the people. Rebecca said when we were driving, she said, "Oh, when Jesus showed up and said, 'Other flocks I have, other sheep I have, which are not of this fold,' these guys didn't even know what sheep were. That there were wild goats in the mountains of North America, but they wouldn't know. To them, the only flocks, I think turkeys were a native animal that could have been a flock. But
other turkeys have I. It doesn't have the impact of some things.
So and the Jacob with the olive tree, and they transplant and they cut out the wild and they there were no olives, there were no fruits in the Americas, there weren't domesticated fruit trees. They wouldn't have even known of that technology, so that story would have meant absolutely nothing to them from what we know of the plants and animals. Is that
there were domesticated fruit trees?
Okay,
but I think there is a misconception of native societies that they weren't very involved in agriculture, and I think that the portrayal of Lamanites in the Book of Mormon perpetuates that lie. It's basically a settler colonial lie used to justify the displacement of indigenous peoples, to portray them as less civilized. Not only they have corn, beans, and squash, they had, in the Northeast, sunflowers were a huge crop, tomatoes, potatoes in South and Central America, chocolate. These are all native domesticates. And in fact, native people, because there weren't a lot of animals to domesticate here, focus more on the plants. And so when we look at the food sources of the world today, Native American domesticated plants are the overrepresented in the world food diet today, because they invested so much in domesticating so many different plants and rather than animals.
Think of it, right? Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
And the animals, there were turkeys and dogs that were domesticated. Dogs were often eaten. And in fact, interesting thing about dogs were eaten by native people and raised in, you could call them flocks. They were raised in groups of dogs. Here in the Pacific Northwest, they had dog islands.
You're breaking Rebecca's heart right now when you're eating dogs. Just don't tell her they ate cats. She'd be at the end.
In New York,
the broadcast. You said that. I'm sorry.
In New York, there were the Seneca had a white dog sacrifice that a lot of the missionaries were really interested in, because they thought it was an example of the kind of animal sacrifices, this Jewish scapegoat. And so the missionaries in the 18th and 19th century were really focused on this white dog sacrifice as a potential scapegoat. Well, the idea that it was a scapegoat came about in Seneca circles because of Christian conversion. And so what was a Seneca Christians started to take this older ceremony that involved eating dogs and using their skin as offerings to the holder of the heavens. Then that became a way of transmitting confession of sins and transmitting those sins up to the sky, to the holder of heavens. It became a scapegoat type thing. Well, that didn't happen until the 1820s. And Joseph Smith incorporates that into his worldview. He actually even participated in sacrificing a white dog in his treasure hunting activities in the Susquehanna Valley.
Yeah.
Kind of fascinating.
So my understanding, I read Guns, Germs, and Stills. It's been several years ago. seems to me that they said there were 4 domesticated animals. I think it was guinea pigs, dogs, turkeys, and llamas.
And alpacas, yeah.
Alpacas, yeah, kind of same family there. So, yeah, and that's really all the domesticated animals they had, which is why they never really developed the will, because they didn't have draft animals or any way to pull anything.
Yeah, I'd push back on Jared Diamond a little bit, being here in the Pacific Northwest. I worked closely with Coast Salish nations for the last 20 years on domesticated marine animals. And so, yeah, I mean, they had clam gardens here. Salmon, really, they're not entirely domesticated, but they're pretty close to it. I mean, they certainly did hatchery-like activity prior to Europeans coming and transplanting salmon from one stream to another, transplanting the eggs. This kind of almost domestication of fish was occurring here in the Pacific Northwest. So I think Jared Diamond, I used this book, so I think it's a pretty good book.
Yeah, it's a good book. It's kind of a little dated.
But he also is not as well informed about actual native practices. And, you know, I spent 20 years doing traditional foods in native communities. So
I've got to ask you, Dr. Murphy.
Crabs and lobster myself, but that's just me.
Yeah, well, you know, crabs, certainly we worked with a lot here. Not so much lobsters. That's more on the others.
Every ex-Mormon wants to know, were tapirs domesticated?
Were tapir? No, they were not, and they certainly weren't attached to a chariot.
We have pictures of Dan Peterson riding one, however, so there is that. So I'm just saying.
Well, so that previous slide, they talked about the migration from Siberia. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And this is where we know that the majority of the DNA came from. Through the land bridge, which was amazing. I remember reading about that in like 3rd grade, and my parents telling me, no, that's not where they came from. They came from Jerusalem. And I remember thinking, oh, that's not true. And then as I started going down my rabbit hole, you know, it was amazing how every scientific book, the linguistics, the anthropology, the migrations, the biologists, all of it supported this, you know, of how they had come, when they came. You want to talk a little bit about where they came from and how they got here?
Yeah. So here I want to push back against Hugo Perego that he's not an anthropologist. I'm an anthropologist, and I work as part of a team of anthropologists here in the Northwest looking at migration routes. And it's no longer the predominant view in anthropology that people came across a land bridge and through an ice-free corridor. That's an older view of a previous generation of anthropologists. And so Hugo Perego is just really out of date in terms of his analysis. And he shouldn't be, because the DNA evidence is one of the key evidences that has changed the paradigm that anthropologists are using today, because DNA pushed back the timing of the entry into the Americas well past 10 to 12,000 years ago. Well, that ice-free corridor was only available the ice-free corridor was not available prior to 12,000 years ago. And so DNA shows that Native people were here, as they've said, since time immemorial, maybe 20, in some cases, some evidence, maybe 20, 30,000 years ago. And that's not the only evidence. There are a lot of archaeological sites that show that the first Native people to arrive here participated in maritime cultures. They had things like fish hooks and ropes and nets, and they had maritime technologies. And so my personal take, based on the current evidence, is that the first migrants came by water. And I think it's important, though, to acknowledge.
So that supports the Book of Mormon, right?
No, because they came by water from Northeast Asia.
20,000 years ago or whatever, from Northeast.
From the Pterodactyls' great grandfathers were probably in there somewhere.
Probably from Siberia or areas around that there. And those populations were actually quite diverse before they came over. And I think that's really important. The genetics show that the X lineage being widespread around the world, showing some of that diversity. And so the people that came across, they did go through a bottleneck event in the sense that they lost some of that genetic diversity. So they have only a small subset of the genetic diversity that was in Asia, but it's still a rather diverse group. And Kennewick man, for example, has the oldest evidence of the X2A lineage that we've ever found. And, showing that diversity was there from the beginning.
And how old was Kennewick man?
9,000 years old.
9,000.
Yes, I shouldn't say very beginning, because it could have been, X2A could have come a little bit later than some of those first migrations. There's some evidence, it's still very controversial, but there's some evidence that that maybe even Neanderthals or some sort of archaic human made it here 130,000 years ago. There's some evidence from San Diego of mastodon bones that have been busted up in ways that look very similar to butchering. And that's some of the work that this group I'm involved with in the Pacific Northwest is we're looking at all the mastodon bones that we can get here in this area, doing very careful analysis of them. And a lot of anthropologists are doing this now. And what we're finding, we're pushing those dates back further and further. And for those that are curious about kind of the up-to-date point of view, I would recommend the book by Paulette Steeves, a Cree archaeologist, called An Indigenous Paleolithic. And she looks at the strong archaeological evidence as well as DNA evidence that native people were here before they could have come through that ice-free corridor from the land bridge.
So when the church says tentative science, the science is actually pushing the dates way further away from a Book of Mormon people, saying it can't possibly have been 600 BC to 400 AD. These people were here long before that.
Yeah, since time immemorial is a kind of fair way to say it. And I should acknowledge, too, that Native people have their own stories, and some of them are migration stories, okay? But there are other stories of saying we came from the land and we came from this place. And the Seneca, for example, where the Book of Mormon came from, they say they came from a hill near Canandaigua Lake. That may have been a reason Joseph Smith was interested in hills around Canandaigua Lake, although the hill they emphasize is not Hill Cumorah, it's too further south. But Native people do have their own stories that should be given credence as well. Certainly as valid as any account in the Bible, for example.
Let's go to slide 8, Carrie. Rebecca, can you read that? This is another Trexmo.
We'll see, won't we?
Yeah.
That's
everything
7,
can
right?
be seen
We
through
already
the eyes of
talked about
Trexmo.
that.
Nope, the next one, Carrie.
We've seen this one, haven't we?
Yeah, we've already seen that one. Yep.
Oh, yes. This is one of my favorite Trexmos. He says, we didn't meet others and we didn't come from far across the sea. I'm so tired of this, I'll just say, narrative.
BS narrative.
BS narrative.
BS narrative. That's right.
So that takes us to the next slide.
Says Captain Kirk.
And Rebecca, can you read that one? This one is one that I think we just read about. Were we alone? We talk about they were among the principal ancestors and how they changed it. But the question comes up, were the Book of Mormon people alone? And I think it said previously in the essay that some older people, they assumed that's what it meant. You want to go ahead and read that?
Yeah, that was another moment reading the essay where we just said, oh, come on. Some people may have misunderstood this. Yeah. So it says, we're the Book of Mormon people alone. The Book of Mormon itself, however, does not claim that the peoples it described were either the predominant or the exclusive inhabitants of the lands they occupied. In fact, cultural and demographic clues in its text hint at the presence of other groups. At April 1929 General Conference, President Anthony W. Ivins of the First Presidency cautioned, and I have to say, this is a little known apostle or general authority. They had to dig really deep to find this quote. He cautioned, "We must be careful in the conclusions that we reach. The Book of Mormon does not tell us that there was no one here before them," the people that it's describing, "and it does not tell us that people didn't come after."
I pulled the next slide. Go to the next slide. I pulled the next slide right out of the book that was by Dr. Murphy. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, there's different ways to respond to it. So, in one sense, if migrants came from the Middle East at the time during the time frames proposed in the Book of Mormon, they most certainly wouldn't have been alone. There would have been millions of people here. Okay, but if we take the text, what does the text say? The text is an ideology or an origin story for all of the Americas. And to emphasize that, there are various passages in the Book of Mormon, and I pointed to a couple of them that the essay doesn't even attempt to address, and that is in Ether, when the Lord commands the party of Jared to gather thy flocks, both male and female of every kind, and also the seed of the earth of every kind, and go forth into the wilderness, yea, into that quarter where never had man been. And then Lehi's prophetic claim that this land should be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations, or that as long as they shall keep his commandments, there shall be none to molest them. And so these passages aren't even addressed. I know there's some apologetics that try to say, oh, well, maybe that quarter was in Asia rather than the Americas, but there were people there too. So it's still wrong. And, you know, the one of Lehi, they say, well, maybe they were sinful. And that's one thing that talk about getting irritating is this whole idea of the narrative of the Book of Mormon that Native people lost their right to the sovereignty of this land because they weren't righteous. Well, were the conquistadors righteous? I mean, do they deserve the conquest and sovereignty of this land? I mean, the whole narrative, unfortunately, is a way for settler colonialists to justify their presence on stolen land. The land never belonged to the settlers in the first place, and the only way it was taken was in ways that were egregiously wrong by the basic simple moralities of Christianity and every other world religion. And it was wrong. And I think that my thinking is that Joseph Smith was actually troubled by this, as were many people. Many theologians were troubled by this. And so one of the ways that they tried to justify it was by imagining that the native people around them were uncivilized and that there had once been a civilized nation here, because there was abundant evidence of civilization everywhere you looked. And so they said, well, there was an ancient civilized nation that degenerated and lost their sovereignty, lost their right to the land. And then that allowed Europeans to come here and take this land away. Well, it's better explained by disease and warfare and technology than it is by morality. And that's where Jared Diamond's book is quite helpful to think about. But the Book of Mormon narrative really denigrates native cultures, which were moral on their own terms. And certainly during the conquest behaved far better than our European ancestors.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. And so basically they did not come into an empty land, but the Book of Mormon tells us that it was. And I think all of us learned that growing up. I know I'd heard, oh yeah, it was saved for the righteous people. There was no other people here. They came, they colonized it. And we know from the genetics and the anthropology and everything else that they'd been here for thousands and thousands of years prior. These other groups, it was large populations. Even I'm here in Mexico, had millions of people in what was Mexico City during those times. Yeah. So it was a huge population. So that brings up the next.
Let me point out that the largest population centers in North America until 1776 were all native. They're all native communities. They were larger than New York City, larger than Philadelphia, larger than Boston. And yet that's totally ignored.
I'm glad we took a trip down to New Mexico. Yeah, we went to Chaco. We went to, and a couple months before that, we went to Albuquerque. I grew up here. I grew up in Utah. I had no idea that the oldest cities were. Albuquerque has some of the oldest buildings in America. Are colonial Spanish buildings that were there from the 1700s, and yet you never learn anything about that. And then you have Chaco over there. That's just an incredible civilization. Just incredible to go through. No, I'd never even heard of Chaco. And what an incredible civilization is. We took about a month ago. We went down there, and just incredible. Beautiful. And I never learned about Chaco. I never knew about the peoples that were here, who'd been here for thousands of years.
Yeah, that's all criminal, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely never taught that.
Yeah, and have you heard of Cahokia?
No.
Yeah, Cahokia. Yeah.
Cahokia is Monk's Mound's largest mound in North America, and it's east of St. Louis in what was a large city, larger than London at 1000 AD. And, it's part of a very large mound building culture that spread across the Mississippi and southeastern valleys and up into the Susquehanna and New York areas. In fact, these mounds were still being built while Joseph Smith was alive. David Cusick, who's a Tuscarora author who wrote a book called Sketches of the Ancient History of Six Nations, that I think Joseph Smith borrowed a lot of the stories in the Book of Mormon from. Well, he writes about visiting one of the mounds in 1800 in the Susquehanna Valley in a town called Sydney today. And he describes the process that they're built and Iroquois people building them. Tuscarora are one of the Six Nations of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So mound building, it never disappeared. And in fact, Native people still build mounds today. We have a serpent mound in Seattle in Discovery Park. The Choctaw Nation, their headquarters got mounds. They never stopped building them mounds. But there's this mythology that developed, and people like Rod Meldrum and the Heartland group perpetuate this mound builder mythology that these ancient nations disappeared. They didn't disappear; they're still here, and they're still building mounds.
They had to be, but in their theology, it had to be white people who built these mounds because natives could not have possibly developed civilizations that large, which plays into that. So
that sounds racist to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah. I see a lot of comments in the comments about Mesa Verde, and that's an incredible. We went to both there, Mesa Verde and then to Chaco. And beautiful. Both are just such impressive civilizations. It's incredible to go see those.
That Hopi Navajo land is some of my favorite. It's just fabulous, man.
Yeah,
hot too, so go in the right month.
Carrie, can you pull up the next slide?
You bet.
So, this one didn't quite translate correctly either, but it says nothing is known about the extent of intermarriage and genetic mixing between Book of Mormon peoples or their descendants and other inhabitants of the Americas, though some mixing appears evident even during the period covered by the book's text. What seems clear is that the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples likely represented only a fraction of all DNA in ancient America. Finding and clearly identifying their DNA today may be asking more of the science of population genetics than it is capable of providing.
There's the key right there. See?
We're calling the science into question, which was upsetting us. So did they intermix, and is it asking too much of genetics to find these people?
Tell that to that Native American woman who migrated to Iceland and left descendants. Or how about the Native people that migrated to Polynesia in the 12th century and left descendants? We have evidence of those migrations today in DNA. We also have other evidence of things like the sweet potato, for example. So we have archaeological and botanical evidence that support some of these migrations of Native people. And I emphasize the migrations of Native people because, again, our stereotypes of Native people is that somehow they were this uncivilized Lamanite sort of thing. Well, they were traveling, and we found evidence of native travels.
Good
so why
point.
can't we find Middle Eastern DNA coming into the Americas? We most definitely would if even if let's say it was a small population, but that population had millions of descendants, and that's kind of the key, or even thousands of descendants, we would find it. If a small population came in, and this is maybe what happened with the Vikings, okay, is that the Vikings don't appear to have mated with the Native Americans. There's no evidence that they did, except for this native woman who went back to Iceland, probably with the Vikings. And that's the evidence we have of native and Viking intermarriage. Is actually the evidence is there. So,
We
And
find
we're talking
but
maybe
the Vikings probably didn't intermarry, or if they did, very few of them did so, and they didn't have descendants. But the Book of Mormon describes a scenario in which you had a small group, supposedly, as the apologists interpret it now, a small group that then intermixes with this larger population, but they have thousands of descendants. With those thousands of descendants, you're going to maintain the genetic origins, because they're going to be breeding with each other, or having children with each other, and then they're going to pass on more and more of that genetic heritage. And certainly, if you got millions of descendants like that Neanderthal that found a sexy,
well, the numbers in the end wars add up to many, many, many hundreds of thousands, if not close to millions as well. Now, the interesting thing is the story says that the Nephites were completely destroyed and only the Lamanites remained. But throughout the text of the Book of Mormon, you always do have the crossover with Lamanites to Nephites and Nephites to Lamanites and all. So to say that the entire nation was destroyed is not to say the science can't find it, because it would have been in all sides.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, every lineage that's provided in the Book of Mormon traces back to the Near East. There's not a single one that traces elsewhere. None. And that includes Lamanites as well as Nephites. That includes the Melecites.
Yeah.
And
right.
So even though there are some different groups, there's not a single one that comes from elsewhere, not a single lineage ever mentioned that came from elsewhere. And do you think that if Nephites came in, as some of these apologists have suggested, and I misspoke earlier when I said that it was, I should have said it was Brian Hales, who has a recent article in Interpreter on this teeny tiny migration. But anyway, if this, now I lost my train of thought. What was I saying?
This small migration that came in, the Nephites, the Lamanites, if we want to,
I know what I was saying.
They didn't intermix with others. They maintained their line. They did break off into the Lamanites and the Nephites, but we know the Nephites supposedly didn't interbreed because they were dark skinned, so they wouldn't intermix. And so they had each of them had thousands of descendants who certainly would have intermixed with the other peoples that were here. They're
all the same lineage anyway.
That line had been blown up to where it was hundreds of thousands of individuals, according to the book. That couldn't possibly have gone undetected, I wouldn't say.
Yeah, and this occurred over a 1,000-year period, keep in mind. So if your descendant populations are growing for 1,000 years, and you're not going to lose that. There's no way you're going to lose that genetic.
You can't. And then Haggoth disappeared, and they speculate that's the origin of the Polynesians. So that's spreading, and yet their genetics don't come from Jerusalem either.
No, they don't. And
Simon Silverton informed me of that.
So anyway, what I was saying earlier is that if this small group of, say, Nephites took over like a Mayan city or something, and became the elites of the city, as some apologists have proposed, then the Book of Mormon would mention those people, right? Because take the Popol Vuh, which is a Quiche Maya text that describes a Nahua group that comes into Maya territory, and they take over another population, and there are repeated references to the nations that they conquered, and so and in fact the Popol Vuh is used as a model text for the Book of Mormon, and yet it provides ample evidence that a small population coming into a new area and conquering people are going to mention those other people, and they're going to acknowledge their heritage and their lineages as well, not just all tracing back to the Nahua in the case of the Popol Vuh. And I should say I published an article in the last summer's Journal of Mormon History on the Popol Vuh, and looking at it within its 16th century context, and looking at why there were some biblical parallels that it got incorporated into the Popol Vuh, and they were not intended by the people who made those incorporations into an older Mayan mythology or Mayan history, even, because some of it's historical. But what they were doing was trying to make comparisons to, say, Sinai. We had a Sinai-like event in our history. We had a revelation from our God. And so they're not saying that they came from Sinai. They're saying that we've had similar things to what you see in the Bible. And so what they were trying to do was validate their own sacred narratives vis-a-vis the Bible. And that's how those biblical parallels get into it. And this happens all over native cultures. And so Mormon apologists will go and say, oh, well, there's some Jewish element here or there. There's a discussion of a flood, that there is a Tower of Babel or whatever. Well, those were incorporated as a way of saying we have our own scriptures, we have our own sacred narratives, and they're just as valid as yours.
Right. Good point.
Carrie, can you pull up the next slide? It's pretty wordy. I hope you can read it. So the next question,
I'll read it.
Is can scientists determine when DNA mixing would have occurred? You want to read this? This is the church's point of view.
I'm going to point my face down so nobody can look up my nose. At the present time, scientific consensus holds that the vast majority of the Native Americans belonged to sub-branches of the Y chromosome haplogroups C and Q, and the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X, all of which appear to have come to the Americas via migrations from East Asia. Ongoing studies continued to provide new insights that both challenge and confirm previous conclusions. For example, this sounds like Hugo Perego, doesn't it? Oh, sorry. That's not in the slide. But for example, a 2014 study indicates that as much as 1/3 of Native American DNA may have originated anciently in Europe or West Asia. From this evidence, scientists conclude that some Europeans or West Asians migrated eastward across Asia, mixing with a group that eventually migrated to the Americas millennia before the events described in the Book of Mormon. Additional DNA markers from Europe and West Asia and Africa exist in the DNA of modern native populations, but it is difficult to determine whether they are the result of migrations that predated Columbus, such as those described in the Book of Mormon, or whether they stem from genetic mixing that occurred after the European conquest. This is due in part to the fact that the molecular clock used by scientists to date Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA markers is not sufficiently sensitive to pinpoint I'm hearing an echo, pinpoint the timing of migrations that occurred as recently as a few hundred or even a few thousand years ago. Moreover, no molecular clock is currently available for complete genomes.
Can you address that? Is that true? You talked a little bit earlier about how you could tell exactly when the Jewish populations came over. What's your take on that?
I think, yeah, this does echo Hugo Perego because his specialty is in mitochondrial DNA. He's not as up to date on the work with the full genome. And I'm trying to figure out, what does he mean? There's no molecular clock. He's probably using molecular clock in a very narrow sense of the word. There is a relative form of dating with the full chromosome that basically it's called tract analysis. That basically when we pass on our chromosomes from ourselves to our children, or that we get from our parents, we don't get the chromosomes intact. What we get is the chromosomes recombine in the process of what we call it recombination, and the chromosomes recombine, and every time they recombine, the segments of DNA that came from your ancestors get smaller. So that provides a relative way of dating the full chromosome and how long it was passed on. So if you have an introduction of a new lineage, you can look at how long those tracks are to see when that lineage was introduced. And so that's what's been done with the studies of Latin Americans and Sephardic ancestry or Jewish ancestry from the area of Spain. And there, what they find is that corresponds exactly with non-Jewish migration from Spain as well. So it provides a relative form of dating, showing that those Jewish populations that came to the Americas came at the same time the Spanish did and the Portuguese did, through that relative form of dating. The same technique is been used in these studies of Polynesians with Native American DNA, and showing about a 12th century. So there's actually different influxes of Native American DNA into Polynesian populations. So one of those is an ancient pre-Columbian one about the 12th century, and the other correlates strongly with the French and the English introduction, and Spanish introductions into Polynesia, and showing basically through that relative form of dating. Maybe you don't call it a molecular clock, but it's still a way of dating when these events occur. And so they're actually quite robust. And in fact, these forms of dating are more robust than the molecular clock that we use for mitochondrial DNA or the X chromosome. I mean, the Y chromosome, the male inheritance. The reason they're more precise is because you can base them on large numbers. So when we're looking at the full genome, we're looking at hundreds, thousands of genetic markers, and so we can do statistical analyses and use those statistical analyses to separate out their significance, and that's much more difficult to do with say mitochondrial DNA. So that full genome analysis much more robust. And I will add one more example of that, and that example is in the study of Kennewick Man, or the Ancient One's DNA. So they didn't just trace his mitochondrial DNA, which, as I said earlier, is X2A, but they also did his full genome. So if any of his ancestors had recently come from Europe or the Middle East, that would have been evident, and it wasn't. In fact, all of his ancestors came from the area around Siberia. And that's important because there's been some debate, is because the X lineages that are found in Asia are distantly related to X2A. Okay. And so if they're distantly related to X2A, is it possible then that as this essay suggests, there was this ancient migration? Yeah, there was an ancient migration. It wasn't a recent one. That's basically what this shows, is that by looking at the full chromosome, we don't see recent migrants from Europe in the Kennewick Man's DNA. Instead, what we find are those that
ancient ones
that are found around Asia. And so the closest relatives to Kennewick man are all Native Americans. And then the next closest ones are
ironic.
and so there was a big deal made out of it because a couple of one archaeologist in particular, who happens to be a colleague of mine, Jim Chatters, made the foolish statement that the skull looked a little Caucasian, or Caucasoid is the term he used, and then the press ran away with that, calling it Caucasian, which is not the same thing. Caucasoid is a very specific term used by forensic anthropologists that it doesn't mean the same thing as Caucasian, but people interpret it that way, and so people thought Kennewick man was a white man. We don't know the color of his skin, but we do know that Native people had variable skin colors, that they range from rather light to rather dark, and that those gradients of skin colors get darker towards the equator, which shows that Native people have been here for a very, very long time, because those skin color changes are, basically responses to climate that take a long time to happen.
You want to pull up the next Trexmo, Gary?
You bet. Yeah, that's awesome, man. I'm really glad. Oh, this is important. This is critical.
You can
this
read
one of
this
Rebecca's favorites.
This is one of my very favorite ones.
You want to read that one?
Landon? You can read it, Landon.
Yeah, go. You're going to read it?
No, I said you read it, Landon.
Oh, okay. His name is Zelf, Captain. He was a white Lamanite and a warrior and chieftain under the great prophet Onondagas. Now you're just making shit up, Spock. You actually just addressed this. There were varying skin tones, but it had nothing to do with righteousness, but it had more to do with what is it? Latitude. Latitude was what would determine skin color.
Well, yeah, dark skin protects against certain types of cancers, and lighter skin provides some protection against cold. It also provides some. It helps to process vitamin D and to process basically some other amino acids that I'm blanking on the name of. But I think something to point out on that Zelf story that is deeply problematic. You think if a Native person came into your cemetery and dug up your ancestors and then proclaimed that they were like a dark-skinned person like them or whatever, I mean, come on. How ridiculous is this? It's deeply, deeply offensive and illegal, right?
Illegal.
This is grave robbery that Joseph Smith is engaged in. And in fact, the whole treasure-seeking endeavor that he is engaged in is a form of grave robbery. And I write a lot about this in my forthcoming book. I've actually identified a lot of these treasures he was looking for in the Susquehanna Valley. There were Oneida and Mohawks coming there looking for those same treasures. They were treasures that they buried in 1778 when they were leaving, when the Sullivan campaign was coming in. And these treasures belong to people.
Yeah.
And Joseph Smith and his family and others were trying to dig up these native treasures and rob the Native people from their possessions that they had hidden as refugees in war.
Yeah.
Well, I hadn't heard that. That's new.
Well, that's my new book. You got to read it.
Okay. We will definitely be looking at that.
We read Dan Vogel and we read Dr. Thomas Murphy.
That's right. We're getting the top of the hour, so I'm going to kind of consolidate the last couple of slides. We don't need to necessarily show them, Carrie.
Okay.
Tom, I was hoping you could, in the essay, they talk about 3 reasons why we're not picking up the DNA: the founder effect, population bottleneck, and genetic drift. And they use those as kind of excuses as why we're not picking up the DNA of the Nephite Lamanite people. Can you address, is there any validity to that? Is there any possibility that any of those would make that genetic marks disappear? You know, would it make just a small piece of it disappear, or would the whole genome basically disappear for those people? And I may be using genome wrongly there, but
those are all what in, say, an introductory biological anthropology course we call the mechanisms of evolution. That is, those are ways that changes in populations occur over time. Okay, so they're all valid biological principles and well-known biological principles that you'll see in basically every introductory biology or biological anthropology class. But so they are real principles. And they would have absolutely been necessary if a population had disappeared. Okay, something like that would have almost definitely had to have happened. The problem with using them in the case of the Book of Mormon is that these are not the types of scenarios that would happen with that large population growth that I was talking about earlier. To use it to example of the founder effect, the reason that, say, the mitochondrial lineages that we find in Native America, there's only 5 lineages and there's more than a dozen in a couple dozen in Asia, that's a founder effect, because a subset of Asian populations probably came via boat to the Americas, and the people that didn't come didn't transport their DNA. So the DNA in Native Americans represents only a subset of Native American populations. Did that also happen with Lehi's party? It most definitely would have, right? What we would see if there was a founding event like described in the Book of Mormon, it would not be representative of all the DNA types we see in the Middle East. What it would be is representative of a select few. Okay, but it would still be representative of that few, and we don't even find the few. Okay, and basically, take genetic drift, for example. Genetic drift is accidental changes in a population frequency. Let's say a group of animals are on one side of a river that serves as a barrier, and another group of mammals is on the other side. Okay, and there's a big landslide that wipes out one side of the river and doesn't wipe out the other side. What you're going to get is an accidental effect on the genetic diversity. If just a couple more of one lineage happened to be on this side of the river, then now in subsequent populations that lineage is going to be more frequent. But the really important thing about genetic drift is these are random events, and random events are random. Okay, and in the Book of Mormon, what is required is not random, but the same event happening over and over and over and over and over and over and over again with every type of DNA. So the mitochondrial DNA, the Y chromosome DNA, all the thousands of hundreds of thousands of markers across the genome, all our microbiome, all of the animals that came with all the lice in our hair, all of them, all the animals that supposedly came with us, every one of those having the exact same genetic drift? No way. No way. The exact same random event does not happen in every single population. It's not random at that point. It's BS.
So they're basically using scientific principles to make it sound as if it's a reasonable conclusion that it could disappear, but it almost sounds like they're doing it to intentionally fool us or tell us these are the things that could have made it happen, even though they know fully well that it really would not have made that happen. There's no way it would have completely disappeared.
Yeah, I think it's a smokescreen. Yeah.
Interesting.
And they called the science tentative. If you remember, there was a great comment back on the thread where they said the science is tentative, but now we're going to tell you exactly how it fits our narrative, so you can use that.
Well,
yeah, it was it was Daisy, I think, that made the comment, and I thought that was really good.
And why not? Why can't the Book of Mormon be tentative?
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah,
well, it has to be.
Would be. Yeah,
Smith was right. 2/3 of it still have yet to come forth.
Right. I mean, there are actually quite a few passages in the Book of Mormon that suggest that it's an incomplete record, that they did a lot of things weren't written down, that they couldn't tell everybody's perspective. In fact, even
Who
Jesus
says the Book
criticizes
of Mormon is the standard? Yeah.
Very Jesus criticizes the Nephites for not keeping the whole story. Right.
Correct.
So why not say the Book of Mormon is tentative?
Good point.
I like it. Okay. Right here on the Backyard Professor, the first program, we are going to say the Book of Mormon is what is tentative. Okay,
there we go.
It's on record. No, that's a great point.
And we consider the matter closed.
And there's textual evidence to support it.
Yeah, truly. Well, there's doctrinal evidence that support it. Yeah. As far as their brethren go, they can't possibly say it's complete.
Well, the reason that they don't go that way is that we want to make it about Joseph Smith's prophetic ability, right? That somehow he has to produce history to be a prophet. Well, no other prophet produced history, so why should he?
Right. Very excellent point, too.
Yeah. I love Mosiah's comment there. Another tentative of Jesus Christ.
There are so many.
Jerry, let's pull up the last slide. Let's go to the conclusion. This is the conclusion from the essay. Yeah, jump to the last one there. And Rebecca, you want to read the conclusion, and then we'll close out.
No, I'm not going to be able to. Sorry, it's too small. I'm on a very small computer right now, so I'm kind of leaning in. So,
much as critics and defenders of the Book of Mormon would like to use DNA studies to support their views, the evidence is simply inconclusive. Nothing is known about the DNA of the Book of Mormon peoples. Even if such information were known, processes such as population bottleneck, genetic drift, and post-Columbian immigration from West Eurasia make it unlikely that their DNA could be detected today. As Elder Dallin H. Oates of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles observed, it is our position that secular evidence can neither prove nor disprove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, brethren. Now, I will simply say I entirely agree with him. However, notice how they keep miswording this whole thing. It has nothing to do with proving or disproving anything. We have to find out what is most probable, and that the church will not go to.
Well, science is never going to be able to tell us whether the Book of Mormon is divinely authenticated. Okay, its divinity we can't answer, but we can address its historicity, and it clearly is not a history. And it's the science is definitive on that regard. It's not tentative, I think I would wish, this is what I wish, that the DNA essay ended with the statement that President Nelson has recently said. In fact, said to an audience of Native Americans when he made a big donation to a museum in Oklahoma. He says the Book of Mormon is not history. It's not a history textbook. Now I'm paraphrasing. He said this before to mission presidents. It's not history. It's not a history textbook. Interestingly, the Native Americans that he made that big donation to gave the money back.
Wow.
He did what now? They
gave the money back.
They gave the money back. Well, even with him confessing that it's not a history, he's not gone far enough. If Mormons want to repair their relationships with Native Americans, they need to very clearly say it is absolutely not history, and that your histories are valid on their own terms.
On their own terms, not within the Book of Mormon context that we have stamped on you. Yeah, yes, sir.
And that's the point I think you were saying that you and Angela were trying to go to is that Native Americans need to be able to define their history on their terms and not on the terms of a church with a book that is not historical or accurate. And let me ask you this question in closing. If the Lamanites and the Nephites did not exist, would you be able to detect that with the DNA?
If they did not exist? Well, I mean, that would be exactly what we see.
Exactly. Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Here.
There you go.
Uh,
That's right.
Let me have one closing comment. Let's suppose you have a new neighbor move in, right? Your new neighbor comes over and tells you where they came from, and you know who they are, and you responded by saying, "No, you didn't. You came from wherever else. You don't know your own history. You don't know your family. You don't know who you are. I know who you are. I know who you are because why? Well, because I'm a colonist and I have big guns. I don't."
Yeah.
Great.
Pure arrogance.
It's really deeply offensive.
Excellent analogy. Yeah.
And that's where
And God told me who you are.
Yeah, God told me. Yeah.
God
Right.
told me who you are.
I have a feeling you
On top
came
of
from
that.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I prayed about it.
Really? You got a Jersey accent. You must have come from Jersey. You know?
And let's just be respectful. That's all I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
And in layman terms, really brought that home. That was really pretty powerful as you
Really
watched that, to see the native peoples and asking. They'd ask senior missionaries or missionaries that working at different places, and it was fun. It was funny, but it was sad what they responded with. You know, they would tell them, "No, your ancestors committed. You know, they were bad people and they have bad culture." And you could just hear it in Angelos' voice. He was like, "I don't think my ancestors were bad." You know,
Well, and then that one,
you're here telling me that.
yeah, that one part of the interview where he just flat out said, he said, "Well, I don't believe that Lamanite story at all." And the guy tried very hard to say, "Well, I mean," it kind of stumped him. It shocked him how bold he was. But then he came back and he tried to say, "Well, but there's no other church out there who treats your people better." I'm going, really? You know, Judas Priest, can you directly lie any stronger? I mean, wow.
Yeah, look at the size of the reservations in Utah.
Oh, don't get me started. Yeah. Or here in Idaho. And the quality of the reservations is just, it's so sad. We still haven't rectified it. So, yeah. Well, Dr. Murphy, your work is not only impressive, but it really is important. And I know most of us don't really see the progress you're making and all, but it's not a thankless job. That's one reason why we wanted so bad to have you on this show. One, because your expertise, and two, because you're a heck of a great guy, but your knowledge in this can help the rest of us who are so ignorant in at least beginning to try to appreciate others' cultures and respect it on its terms. It's very similar to my big beef with Mormon doctrine. They always try to Mormonize the Bible. I hate how they do that. Well, that's what they're doing with people. They're trying to Mormonize groups of people. And I find it a breath of fresh air and refreshing that you are standing up, and we will now stand up with you, starting with this podcast. We're going to do more with you also. And I know Mormonish wants to do some with you, where we get to stand up with you and say, yeah, that's enough with the India. And I know there are people who are saying the same thing about the ridiculous Polynesian issue with the Mormons and Hagoth and the Book of Mormon, and how they've tried to change their culture. I mean, the virus has spread to the point where we really do need to get a doctor in here like yourself and say, look, let's get rid of the disease. So that's about the best analogy I can think of, because I now see it as a disease. It's a disease of cultural murder. And it's just immoral as far as I'm concerned. Am I saying that too strongly? If I am, I'll admit it and say I'm guilty, but I'm still going to say it. But that's what it is, in essence. I mean, the Indians, the Native Americans, the Eskimos, the indigenous peoples, no, South America, Central America, North America, they don't force white kids into their cities and cultures and tell them, oh no, you can't cut your hair any longer, and you can't wear that kind of clothing, and oh no, you have to change what you eat, and oh no, you don't get to spend your day doing what you used to. Now you have to do. Nobody does that to us. Well, what the hell? How come we think we have that right to do that to others? So that's where the racism and the, what you call it, colonial. Yeah. The great westward expansion, manifest destiny, all that noise that we.
When do you expect your book out, Dr. Murphy?
Yeah. When's your book?
It's in review right now, so it'll be probably a year or two. And
What?
I will be speaking, though, at the John Whitmer Historical Association. I will be one of the plenary speakers speaking about what I call the Peacemaker Epic and Iroquois Influence on Joseph Smith, ? And the preview is there are indigenous narratives of a peacemaker that have a lot of similarities with the Book of Mormon. And so I've gone back through the literary record of those oral traditions and placed the Book of Mormon within the context of these narratives. Well, you'll have to.
We'll have to read it.
Oh, come on, tell us more. Don't hold back.
Thank you for doing this, though, because this is the kind of science that we need to have, where you put these into the context of what was really happening and see how it flushes out, not use the book as we got to try to prove the book. We've got to see how the book would fit into these, and does it or does it not? And that's the kind of science we really need to see. So thank you for doing
and we will always agree with them. Sure, the science is always going to be tentative.
Yeah.
That's not the point.
Exactly.
They're trying to make it seem like it's a negative. It just isn't. It's not a negative, because like Dr. Murphy and like Dr. Rittner said, well, sure, we don't know everything, but what we damn sure do know is the papyri don't give us the Book of Abraham, and the DNA don't give us the Book of Mormon Lamanites. That we can say pretty certainly, right? So thank you once again, Dr. Murphy. Rebecca, do you have any last words you'd like to say to Dr. Murphy and all that? We'll let you.
Well, I think my favorite statement is when Landon said, what would it look like if the Lamanites or Nephites had not existed? And Dr. Murphy said, pretty much exactly what it looks like now. I think those are the words to take away from this episode. If there's anything that you want to take away, I think that was perfectly stated. And we just appreciate Dr. Murphy for being on here so much. It was wonderful. And it was kind of last minute that we reached out. So we appreciate you being available and working with us on everything. I know this was a wonderful episode. I hope that your viewers loved it too.
I am certain that they did. Thank you all. And we will return with much more good quality information as fast as we can, and share it with you. So appreciate all your support and love. And let's try to support the good scholarship, the science, the quality of information that we've all complained that the church has kept from us by buying Dr. Murphy's book when it comes out. Like Dan Vogel's book, we would like to make sure that we sell out Dr. Murphy's book so it forces him to write a second edition.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.